The Supreme Court of the United States has brought an end to affirmative action. It has considered race-based admissions policies to be unconstitutional. This is really about a case regarding Harvard and the University of North Carolina. It was brought by Students for Fair Admissions, which is a group of mainly Asian students, saying that they'd been discriminated against by these race-based affirmative action policies. Now, Tom, looking at this, if you were a sane person and you saw the level of kind of essentially racist discrimination that was happening against Asian Americans, you might think, well, good, isn't this a positive step? But that's not quite how people have reacted, is it?
It's not. I mean, this is, as far as I'm concerned, a quite clear blow for genuine racial equality.
Yeah.
Removing you dress it up as affirmative action, but it's race-based admissions. That's effectively what we're talking about here. And whilst it might have previously been practiced with the best of intentions as far as trying to make sure that you close the gap, particularly between African Americans and the rest of American society, it has morphed into something incredibly ugly and discriminatory. The idea that this is some sort of prop for white supremacy doesn't really work when, as you were suggesting, the people most disadvantaged, particularly elite universities, by this program were Asian Americans. You got into a situation in which they would have to far outstrip, in terms of test scores, their black or even white counterparts in order to get there, because of the fact that Asian Americans in particular disproportionately do very well at school and in tests and at university and so on. So you had a situation in which you had elite universities having to concoct increasingly, to my mind, almost explicitly racist sort of policies in order to keep those numbers down. You have these kind of racial bean counts. We've got too many Asians. What we can do about it? You introduce a personality test, which might downgrade certain things which, culturally speaking, Asian Americans tend to excel at, and upgrade things that maybe they don't, on average, tend to excel at. All of these things which are really, really ugly. And yet the response naturally has been, oh, Jim Crow's coming back. This is the worst thing that ever happened. The other thing that's so mad about this is the fact that affirmative action as well is something that has benefited a very small layer of American ethnic minority society. That's what I mean. Wilfred Riley made this point on Spikes today, was that even if you're talking about black Americans, there's this kind of notion about that what these policies were doing were plucking kids from the inner city ghettos and putting them in elite universities. It's not what was happening.
Yeah.
The primary beneficiaries of it, particularly amongst the black American population, were often the very well-to-do, very well-educated sons and daughters of Jamaican or African immigrants, for instance. And what you kind of had an incredibly perverse situation where they were advantaged, where, say, the son or daughter of a Vietnamese cab driver was disadvantaged. Yeah. How could anyone defend this? And it's also striking that, again, it cuts across party lines. You poll Americans, do you think you should have race-based admissions? 70% of them say no.
Yeah.
But it does, as I say, speak to the very topsy-turvy world that we live in now, which is to say that a move to remove race as a criterion for whether or not you should get into university is seen as a blow for white supremacy, even when doing so will disproportionately benefit Asian Americans. But that's the rabbit hole we've tumbled down in recent years.
Charlie, what have you made of it?
Well, I mean, I read Thomas Sowell's book, Intellectuals and Race, an incredible kind of creed against affirmative action a few years ago. And I just had a kind of 2-minute audiobook summary of all the arguments in it, which is pretty useful.
Could have saved you.
Yeah, good effort there. Yeah, what a waste of time I had on that. So I think it's a pretty significant blow against sort of the race communism, obsessive, identitarian, racialized politics we've had, whereby any differences between groups are treated as huge evidences of structural hate, and that the system is designed to attack certain groups. And you always hear, I think, a lot from people on the right in particular, that politics is downstream of culture, and that if Hollywood is woke, then politics will be woke, and therefore you have this affirmative action stuff coming through. I think the opposite is true. And the reason why we have so much kind of racialized politics and obsession with identity is because of these political structures that govern us and set the standard around the world. I mean, America being the global empire of cultural and economic power means that whenever they do stuff, the rest of us really listen in. And on racial politics, that is definitely the case. Now, in Britain, in kind of 0 to 5-year-olds, over 11% of under 5s in Britain are of Asian descent. For blacks, African, West African or Caribbean, it's less than 6. But despite that huge population disparity, all of our political focus on racial disparity is on black Britons. There's barely any time spent on disparities with other groups. Even like Eastern Europeans don't make the conversation, even they have plenty of significant lineage and heritage in the country. So I think, this kind of impact will have a positive effect, not only in America, but also in Britain. All those American companies and universities that recruit from Britain, that have an impact on our cultural setting and our national conversation, no longer will they have the political justification, I think, to push this nonsense onto us. So that's my hopeful take on this change.
I suppose it is. What's interesting is that we get America's conversation on race foisted on us, but it's even warped for its own context. It doesn't even work there because America is, ironically, it's far more diverse than the race obsessors would have you believe, because they seem to do just divide things between black and white. It's not only that they're ignoring the fact that these Asian Americans are discriminated against. If they do acknowledge their existence, they say they're just puppets for white supremacy, or that that they are white as well. There have been some attempts in American school districts to redefine Asians as white, as part of the white racial group, in order to kind of justify this or to continue this narrative of white supremacy being prevalent.
And I think it's also worth pointing out that this, whether we're talking about affirmative action or this general way of approaching questions of racial disparities and so on, is really bad for, say, black Americans as well.
Yeah.
First of all, because of the fact that as we were talking about, the vast majority of African Americans are not going to be positively impacted by Harvard taking a few, again, second-generation Jamaican immigrants into their universities. Nothing will change whatsoever. You're also talking about one of the problems which a lot of writers have noted, is the fact that, again, if you're in a situation where you've got an African-American kid who's going to university, if he's put into a university in which he's not ready for, because the school system he might have gone through was crap, because for all kinds of different particular reasons, the likelihood that he drops out and ends up with no degree at all is a lot higher. Where if he gets placed at a university that is at his current kind of grade level, if you like, he's much more likely to go on, get that law degree, get a practice, whatever it might be. And the broader point is the fact that essentially treating African Americans as a permanent victim class, permanent children who are in need of a leg up in order to get on in society. Meanwhile, you ignore one of the primary things which genuinely does impact upon life chances in the black community, but across American society, which is the class questions, which are completely obscured by this very elitist identity politics, which is obsessed with university classrooms and boardrooms, but has nothing to say about the inner cities or the factory floor. So again, no one is well served by this, apart from the self-appointed racial bean counters who are empowered by this process. Other than that, no one's winning out from it.
And one really, disturbing thing is the way that this kind of racial movement sort of reifies race. It revives racial segregation, racial thinking, thinking about people in terms of race. I mean, Ibram X. Kendi, one of the luminaries of the Black Lives Matter movement, says quite explicitly that we live in a systemic racist society, and the only way to correct that is with discrimination. You correct past discrimination with future discrimination. I mean, it's just such a horrifying way of looking and thinking of the world.
Extremely. And Tom points towards the struggles that puts on black kids who get pushed to a university which they might not succeed at. They drop out, their lives get worse, but it also affects the rest of us too. It's one thing having someone over promoted into a philosophy seminar where they don't really know what they're talking about and they're not so great on this week's reading on Aristotle, and they probably should have gone to a different university or whatever. But when you start doing affirmative action and boosting people's scores to get into medical programs or engineering programs, okay, that's really bad for everyone else too. If you were an American, you'd be very nervous, I think, going to have surgery. Are you sure that everybody there has got the qualifications for the right reasons with the right scores, or have they been bumped up for affirmative action reasons? And again, if it happens at university, there's no reason why it won't happen in other areas of the world. We've seen in Britain in the last year or so a big issue with the RAF doing diversity quotas for fighter pilots. People that are required to maintain the defense of the state being picked based on their racial background. I feel like the skies are a little less safer with affirmative action policies for F-35s. I don't want it in there. I definitely don't want it in surgery. So we shouldn't have it at any level.